as we try to do. There we go. So in 1 Samuel chapter 1, we read about a woman named Hannah. And Hannah is, Hannah is this is the wife of this man named Elkanah, and he doesn't just have one wife; he has two. He has this one woman whose name is Peninnah or something like that, and then Hannah herself. Now the problem that comes up here between Hannah and her co-wife is that she is very sort of jealous of her, because the one can have children and the other cannot. Hannah's barren, but her husband, for whatever reason, favors Hannah over the other wife. He gives her more gifts, he cares for her more, and this causes, as you can probably guess, a lot of strife between the two. And so that's the scene that we're coming into here in 1 Samuel chapter 1. Let me say something about the Church of the Latter-day Saints before we read this, though. As you know, Laura and I have been having studies with the Mormon missionaries that are coming through town, and one of them's name is Matthews, and the other's name is Hasbernot, something to that effect. I think that's it. He helped us practice saying his name yesterday several times, and I still couldn't get it really well. But anyways, Matthews to us is Hasbernot to him. So whereas saying Matthews is probably really easy for us, for him, and in his culture, those other types of names are a lot easier to say. Well, not for me. But anyways, we're studying with them, and I asked them, just out of curiosity, what the Mormon stance on polygamous marriages were. And so at the start of their church with Joseph Smith, they allowed polygamy for a time to sort of bolster the numbers a little bit. But then later on, a future president of the church received an alleged, direct revelation from God that polygamy wasn't necessary anymore. And so today, on the outside, for the most part, they do not practice polygamy. At least this is what we're told. Now, there's certain fringe movements that do practice polygamy, and you see those on televisions, on your reality shows and things like that. But here's something that the church does do. So, within the Church of the Latter-day Saints, you can become eternally bound to someone, or bound to someone. So it's not just that you're living with them here on this life, but if you go to a Mormon temple and you make an eternal covenant with someone, then you will continue to be with that person even after death in the afterlife, depending on what kingdom you go to. I think I've told you about that before. And so you're eternally bound with that person as a spouse in the afterlife. Okay? Now, they say that they don't teach polygamy anymore here on this earth, but here's what they do. They do. If you are a man and your woman dies, your wife dies, and you go and you find love somewhere else, you can take that woman to the temple and be eternally bound to her as well. And so you can eternally be bound to, another woman, or if you're a man, to another woman on top of your wife, as much as you need to. If your wives keep dying, you can go and get eternally bound to her, to someone else over and over and over again. But if you're a woman and your husband dies, whom you were eternally bound to, you can never be eternally bound to someone else again. And so the polygamous relationships, although they seem to have been exterminated here on earth, they're still very much going on in the afterlife, at least is what we're told. And so whenever you're talking to a Mormon missionary and they talk about polygamous marriages, keep that in mind. That's how it actually is. They don't practice it here on earth per se, but they are being eternally bound to several women, whereas a woman does not have the right to be eternally bound to several men. Do you see sort of the, issue there? Which, a lot of people's opinions, and I asked them about this, they said that not every man and woman gets eternally bound to each other, even though they're married. And so that says a lot about how they feel about each other here on earth. But whenever you're talking to Mormon missionaries, even though we know those points of contention, what I've talked to people who were even ex-Mormon. We've watched a lot of YouTube videos and read articles online. Really, Mormon missionaries don't really respond to that very well. If you want to be contentious with them and bring up, skips, mess ups in their doctrine or cracks in what they're saying, you can do that, and it may be effective for someone. But what a lot of people have said is the most effective thing is to ask them, have they been born again? Have they really had an experience in their life where they went from understanding that they were, a sinner and outside of the presence of God, to being overcome by the love and mercy of God and responding to the gospel, and repentance and confession and baptism and things like that. And see, because in the Mormon religion, it's a largely works-based sort of situation, and so a lot of them never have that overwhelming feeling of the love of Christ in their life. And so if you talk to them about that, a lot of people say that's one of the most effective things that you can do. And so Laura and I are changing our game plan a little bit, and I'm going to stop doing what I do and start doing what's been suggested to us, because if you know me, I like to talk about, the logic behind things, and so we get into the, Book of Mormon versus the Bible, and I, show things, and then they just kind of look at you like, well, Joseph Smith said this, so that really doesn't even matter. So I'm going to stop doing it that way and try to do it this other way. So maybe if they come to your house, you can do the same thing. Okay, 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 1. You're going to have some fun this morning hearing me try to pronounce these Hebrew names, of which I have no idea how to pronounce. Now there was a certain man from Ramathim Zophim from the hill country of Ephraim, and his name was Elkanah, the son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, and he is an Ephraimite. He had 2 wives. The name of one was Hannah, that's easy, and the name of the other, Peninnah, whatever, that's more difficult. And she had children, but Hannah had no children. Now this man would go up from his city yearly to worship and to sacrifice to the Lord of hosts in Shiloh. And the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were priests to the Lord there. And when the day came that Elkanah sacrificed, he would give portions to Peninnah his wife and to all of her sons and her daughters, but to Hannah he would give a double portion, for he loved Hannah, but the Lord had closed her womb. Her rival, however, the scripture tells us, would provoke her bitterly to irritate her, because the Lord had closed her womb. So you see what's happening here. The husband is blessing one wife more than the other, and the other wife, who is not being blessed, is using the fact that she can have children to irritate the other wife, to maybe make it seem like she's worthless or no good or something like that. And so there's a huge issues going into this relationship here. Now the husband, he doesn't care if they can have children or not, really. In this situation, he's going to say in just a moment that he loves her, regardless of whether or not she can bear any children to him. But you can see already in the scriptures why a polygamous relationship is probably not the best way to go. Just the competition and the hurt feelings that can go on between, the 2 wives in this situation. And we already know from the story of Abraham what happens with Sarah and Hagar, and there's a lot of jealousy between Ishmael and between Isaac. And so, there is, you got enough on your plate being married to one person, whether you're a man or a woman, because you're trying to work through things and grow together and get to know each other. And adding another person to that connection is not usually a good idea. Jealousy and strife can come up very easily. Okay, here in verse 7 he says, "It happened year after year, as often as she went up to the house of the Lord, she would provoke her. So she wept and would not eat. Then Elkanah her husband said to her, 'Hannah, why do you weep? And why do you not eat? And why is your heart sad? Am I not better to you than 10 sons?'" So this man is, seemingly a pretty good husband, if you overlook the fact that he's, married 2 wives and has caused this situation. But he's trying to be helpful to her. Why do you weep? Why do you not eat? Why is your heart sad? Am I not better to you than 10 sons? One interesting thing that I picked up on when reading through this text is the reference to Hannah's heart. Here her heart is sad, and then later on in the text, the scriptures will say that she was praying not with her voice, but praying with her heart. And so it's interesting how it keeps referring to Hannah's heart throughout this passage. Okay, so verse 9. So Hannah arose after eating and drinking in Shiloh. Now Eli, the priest, was sitting on the seat by the doorstep of the temple of the Lord. She, greatly distressed, prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. She made a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your maidservant and remember me, and not forget your maidservant, but will give your maidservant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and a razor shall never come to his head. Notice there are some things in this chapter, here and then in a passage a little before this, that carry us back to the book of Judges and the book of Ruth, at least in our thoughts. For one, whenever Elkanah says to Hannah in verse 8, am I not better to you than 10 sons? That's really similar to what is said in the book of Ruth. Because in the book of Ruth, Naomi says of Boaz, may he also be a restorer, or rather this is said of Naomi and Ruth concerning Boaz. May he also be to you a restorer of life and a sustainer of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons has given birth to him. So there in Ruth it says that, she's better to you than 7 sons. This Boaz has come in and allowed her to have children for your family. And in this case, in 1 Samuel chapter 1, the husband says to the wife, am I not better to you than 10 sons? One has a reference to the Hebrew tradition of levirate marriage, where the next of kin would marry into the family in order to keep the name of the deceased husband going who had no children. And in this case, it is a husband trying to take care of his sad wife. Now, the reason why she's sad is because of that same tradition. See, in the Old Covenant, remember, how do you produce children of God? You don't produce children of God by going out and proselytizing a bunch of people. You produce children of God by having a child and raising them into the Lord. And so from Hannah's perspective, because of the culture that she lives in, she views herself as not being worth much. And that's not a correct way to view herself. We learn in the New Testament that children of God are made not of flesh but through faith. And yet here we see, because of the culture which she lives in, she's greatly distressed over this matter. Now, in verse 12, we see that this man named Eli is watching her pray. The scripture says, now it came about, as she continued praying before the Lord, that Eli was watching her mouth. Now you might think he's trying to read her lips, but read on, you'll see that's not the case. As for Hannah, she was speaking in her heart. There's reference to Hannah's heart again. Only her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard, so Eli thought she was drunk. So she's over there, just blabbering, making no noise, and Eli's thinking, okay, somebody had a little bit too much at the feast. When they came down here, she might have had a little bit too much to drink. So he says to her in verse 14, how long will you make yourself drunk? Put away your wine from you. But Hannah replied, no, my lord, I am a woman oppressed in spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor out my soul before the Lord. Do not consider your maidservant as a worthless woman, for I have spoken until now out of my great concern and provocation. As a man, it's probably a little bit more difficult for us to understand what's going on in Hannah's mind. But for some of you women, maybe there was a situation where maybe it's the case that you can't bear children, or maybe it's the case that there was a time when you thought maybe you couldn't. I know Laura's voiced to me some concerns that she's had before. What if I can't have children? What are we going to do? This and this and this. And so, there's just, I guess there might be just some fear that's going on here in Hannah's heart that us as men may not have the best time of understanding. We can probably sympathize with it to an extent, but especially for a woman in this ancient culture, the distress that's in her heart is probably more than any of us could imagine. Because remember, for you not to bear a child to your husband was to mean that his name would be cut off from the land of Israel. Now here he has 2 wives, and maybe he has 2 wives because of this issue with Hannah. But nevertheless, this has caused her a lot of stress, more than we probably know. It's caused her enough stress to the point where, she's not even making noises when she's praying. She's just mouthing the words and pouring it out in her heart. Probably doesn't even know what to say at all times. You've probably been in that situation before. So Eli approaches her, starts off by saying, "Put your wine away from you," which is maybe not the best way to lead off a conversation, but it ended up working out. And Hannah replies that she's oppressed and that she needs help, and she's pouring out her soul before the Lord. A point about that, here it says again that Hannah poured out her soul before the Lord. In the book of Isaiah, chapter 53, we learn that one of the things that Jesus did in the cross is, the scripture says in Isaiah 53, that he poured out his soul unto death. That's Isaiah chapter 53, and let's see here. It must be in verses 10 through 12. Yes, verse 12. He says that he poured out himself, or he poured out his soul unto death. And so what Hannah did here, in her extreme grief about not being able to bear any children to her husband, is what Jesus did as well when he was going through his crucifixion, and even the time leading up to that. We see this similar type of thing take place in the Garden of Gethsemane, right? When he's praying before God, and tears and sweat as blood, and his disciples are there off about a stone's throw away, as the scripture says, praying, or rather, sleeping while they should be praying. And so what Jesus did when he's going to the cross is a similar type of sorrow that Hannah was experiencing in 1 Samuel chapter 1. At least it was a similar level of sorrow and grief. And so you can imagine just the stress that Hannah is undergoing here in chapter 1. Just how upset and heartbroken she is over her inability to have children. And by the way, have you seen those crazy people who say that, who think that they're better than another woman because they can have a child a more natural way, whereas the other woman has to have a C-section? Have you seen those things? That's ridiculous, isn't it? And that's kind of what's happening here in 1 Samuel chapter 1. That's no reason to, that's just such a, why would you shame somebody for something that they can't even control? But, oh well. So, 1 Samuel chapter 1, and let's see, verse 17. So, Eli answers and says, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant your petition that you've asked of him." She said, "Let your maidservant find favor in your sight." So the woman went away and ate, and her face was no longer sad. That's just an interesting expression there at the end. Her countenance was no longer sad, or her face was no longer sad. One thing that you see from this experience that Hannah has as she's praying at Shiloh is that she's no longer hopeless, but now she's hopeful. She's really confident at this point that the Lord will grant her the opportunity to bear a child for her husband. And so that just goes to show you the faith that this woman had in God. Ashley?
Reminds me of David when his child was dying and he was laid out and just not eating, not doing anything. And then when he was told that the child died, he got up and got himself together. He got the answer, wasn't the answer he wanted, but he got an answer. He got up and got himself together and went on. It's kind of like she got an answer. That hey, you don't have to be in this state anymore. She got up and got herself together and started eating again.
Yep, that's right. And a lot of times it takes an outside force like that, to wake us up. But also, one of the things that was most likely comforting to Hannah was just that moment that she had of silent prayer and contemplation about who God was and what He had the power to do. And oftentimes that's what we need. Sometimes we can voice audible prayers and, pick out the words that, sound the best and flow well together. But sometimes what's helpful to us is just sitting in silence and silently praying to God and thinking about all the things that He's done for us. So here this method of prayer has greatly assisted Hannah. And so now in verse 19, we see that they arose early in the morning and worshiped before the Lord and returned again. Lonnie, you had something?
Yeah, it's one thing that we need to take account of that she wanted a child so bad, but the first thing she do, she don't ask for herself. She told the Lord that she'll give the child to Him.
That's true.
She didn't ask for herself. She said, I give it to you, and you do your service all the days of your life.
That's right, and that's one thing that James teaches us, right? Is that if we make plans or if we make requests to God, we need to make them to the best of our abilities in line with God's plans. Go to James chapter 4, and we can take a look at that. So in James chapter 4, he's talked all about in this book about praying to God to ask Him for wisdom, pray to God to ask Him for gifts. Good gifts and perfect gifts comes from the Father, or it comes from above. And so here in James chapter 4, we see this in verse 13. He says, "Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a city and spend a year there and engage in business and make a profit. Yet you do not know what your life will be like tomorrow. You are just a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and also do this or that. But as it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. Therefore, to one who knows to do the right thing and does not do it, to him it is sin." So James 4 basically is about these people are making business plans and never thinking about what the Lord's plan was. And while it's not wrong for someone to make business plans, it is wrong not to include God in those plans. Johnny?
Right. Add to what Lonnie was saying about she had made that promise to God that hey, she'll leave him with it. The firstborn male was supposed to be dedicated to the Lord, but you redeemed him back. God gave him a way to redeem that son back. And she said, "Hey, I want to redeem him back. I leave him there." That's what she did. She left him there to where the rest of the firstborn they were able to redeem them and take them back home.
Right, and so this is what, and so she did this. Basically, she just wanted to bear a child for her husband. She wanted that child to live his whole life in service to the Lord at the temple, or not at the temple, but at the tabernacle at this point. Lillian, what were you going to say?
Obviously, this child is not like children today. He obviously didn't have much to say about. He didn't go the other way from the way his mom wanted him to go. Did he?
No. He did what he.
So he just went. As children today, you may say, "I'm gonna give it to the Lord," but they got their own mindset. They do what they want to do. Some of them may stay with the Lord, and some of them won't.
Right. Well, I think that. Well, there's a lot. I'll get myself. I'm going to say it anyways because it's funny. There's a lot of talk about millennials and things like that, which I guess I'm one, but I don't like that word. And a lot of people say, "What's wrong with millennials?" And I ask, "Well, who raised them?" So, if you're raised by people who don't know what they're doing with their kids, then of course they're going to turn out like we have turned out. So blame yourselves for my mistakes. No, not at all. Every person is obviously responsible for their own selves, but there's a sense in which the environment in which they're raised is detrimental to how they turn out. For Samuel, his mom began at a very young age dedicating his life to the Lord. But a lot of people who dedicate their kids' life to the Lord, when it comes down to doing something godly and doing something worldly, a lot of parents have no problem with choosing the worldly path. For example, if the kid doesn't want to go to church, not because he has some obligation or something like that, but if I just don't want to go today, what would Samuel's mom say? All right, you're going. What do a lot of people today say? Well, all right, son, I'm not going to force you. So there's a difference between what you see with Samuel's mom and a lot what you see with parents today. I know from my parents, they basically said, if you're not like visibly bleeding or having to go to the hospital, you pretty much need to go to Bible class. Not really like that, but that's basically how it was. And so we were always raised a certain way, and so Samuel's mom looks like she was doing the same. But a lot of parents don't have that same type of dedication, and then they're surprised whenever their kids don't turn out the way they think they should. Lonnie?
Okay. We done went way ahead of the lesson, but the point is that she didn't raise him. She didn't raise him. He was taken when he was weaned, and that he wasn't that old. When he went there, he wasn't maybe about a year old, maybe was able to eat when he went there.
Sure.
That's one point that we need to take notice of too. He was raised here in the temple, but he was weaned. When he was weaned, she took him there.
Sure. Well, in a sense, that was a decision she made on how to have him raised. So, so that was something that she made the decision to do. No, not everybody would make that type of decision. Not everybody should make that type of decision either, right? Jimmy.
Yeah, Eli, the priest, his sons were not good.
Right.
They were pretty bad.
Yeah, they cause a lot of trouble later on, and not to mention. Well, we'll get there in a little bit, of course, when we get down there, but it's just, we have the expression from the book of Proverbs, raise your child in the way they should go, and when they're old, they should not depart from it. And we have to understand that's a general rule. That's not always going to, that's just basically a general rule on how we should live. And if you want to see that that's a general rule, just go to that one place in Proverbs, do not answer a fool according to his folly. In the verse, either right before that or right after that, it says, answer a fool according to his folly. So you see those things are, pretty much situational. But what we're seeing in 1 Samuel is she's making the dedication from the very beginning of Samuel's life, even before his life, to raise him according to what the Lord would have him to be raised. So let's look at chapter 1 and verse 19. So they arose early in the morning and worshipped before the Lord and returned again to their house in Ramah. And Elkanah had relations with Hannah his wife, and the Lord remembered her. It came about in due time, after Hannah had conceived, that she gave birth to a son, and she named him Samuel, saying, because I have asked him of the Lord. Then the man Elkanah went up with all of his household to offer to the Lord the yearly sacrifice and pay his vow. So this is, so Samuel would have been, 3 months or so old at this point, I guess? If it's a year later and the baby's in the womb, for 9 months or so. He's about 3 months or so old. Okay, so they go back up to Shiloh to worship. Let's see, that is in verse 21. In verse 22, we see that Hannah did not. I will not go up until the child is weaned, and I'll bring him that he may appear before the Lord and stay there forever. Elkanah, her husband, said to her, do what seems best to you. Remain until you have weaned him. Only may the Lord confirm his word. So the woman remained and nursed her son until she weaned him. Now when she had weaned him, she took him up with her with a 3-year-old bull and 1 ephah of flour and a jug of wine. That's not really helping out the impression that Eli had of her, does it? Kidding. And he brought her to the house of the Lord in Shiloh, although the child was young. Then they slaughtered the bull and brought the boy to Eli. And she said, oh, my Lord, as your soul lives, my Lord, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. For this boy I prayed, and the Lord has given me my petition which I asked of him. So I also have dedicated him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he is dedicated to the Lord. And he worshiped the Lord there. So here we have the situation where she takes this offering to the tabernacle, she gives it to Eli, and she makes this sacrifice to God and dedicates Samuel's life to God as well. And so from now on, Samuel is going to be raised in the temple, and his future is going to be filled with exceedingly great blessings, but also a lot of heartbreak when he sees his own people turn against God. Eventually, he's going to see even a man whom he anointed to be king just go, far away from God's will as just about one could go, not as much as maybe some of the later kings would go. So Samuel's going to see a lot of heartbreak in his life, but ultimately, as Hannah wanted, his life is going to be dedicated to the Lord, and he's going to serve to us as a wonderful example of coping with difficult situations and putting our faith in God when it seems like nobody else will. Before we get there, though, we have a song that Hannah's going to sing, or a prayer that she's going to pray, or however you want to call it, and it is going to be very familiar to you. The reason why it's going to be familiar to you is because it's similar to another song that somebody sings, and that's Mary. In the New Testament, whenever Mary, finds that she has a child and she's going to give birth to the Son of God, she gives what's called the Magnificat, right? And this is the one that starts off, "My soul magnifies the Lord," in the book of Luke. And so a lot of what she says there mirrors what is said by Hannah in 1 Samuel chapter 2. So let's read this together. First off, does anybody have any more comments on chapter 1? All right.
These two women in there remind me of the guy that worked for 7 years who wasn't Rachel and Judah.
That's right.
Yeah, those two women too had problems.
That's right. They learned how to be patient. With, in our days of Amazon 2-day delivery, it's really difficult to be patient for God's prayers, or, for God to answer our prayers. I know that, when we pray for things, we're expecting kind of it, to come out instantly like a vending machine. When really with Hannah, it took how many years? I mean, how many years did she go down to the tabernacle to pray to God before her prayers were answered? How many years was it? Well, it was Jacob, right? Or was it? Yeah, it was Jacob. How many years did Jacob work for Rebekah? 14, right? And he said it only seemed as but a moment to me, right? Because of the love that he had for her. And so we're so used to instant gratification that it's difficult for us to live in a way that the people in the Bible did. For us, if we order a package offline and it's not here in 2 days, we're getting kind of worried, right? Do they deliver on Saturday or not? Is he going to get here on Monday? Monday, I can't wait till Monday. It's really, really difficult for us. But here in 1 Samuel, we find a great example of patience and trust in God that we should try to follow in our lives. Jimmy?
I don't have much understanding of how, like Samuel and others have been donated to the Lord or dedicated to the Lord. How did they raise him? Was it a community thing of people in the temple? I know nothing about that.
I just assumed that he'd be raised with the priest's sons. He'd basically be adopted into a Levitical family. In this case, Eli. And they would raise him.
That's normally what they did then. The priest end up with him? Or?
Right, so in this case, he is going to spend a lot of time with Eli and basically minister unto him, follow him around in the temple and take care of things, that he needs to be taken care of, and assist him in any way that he can. So it's kind of like, like an apprenticeship, but just from a very young age. Lonnie?
We need to look at these families as being a family like we are today. These priests was able to get there. They didn't stay single, so they had home to go to. And for one thing, the temple at this time was just a tent structure we look at. And they didn't live in that. They lived in their tent, their houses. I'm talking about the priests. They lived in their own place, but they had to go there. They had to do the sacrifice and stuff. They entered the sanctuary to do all of that. So when they talking about in the home, they're talking about in his place where he was staying. At this time, they wasn't living in the place where the tabernacle was. They had their own home, place where they stayed. So he was raised with a family. These priests had family, wives and all that. But they did their work there.
Right, so it was he basically adopted him to his family, and Samuel.
Always with priesthood?
Well, in this case, I mean, I guess it depends on what the situation is. It might be a prophet or someone. But in this case, it was a priest. And I suppose if you're dedicating them to the Lord, like Hannah did, to specifically serve, in the tabernacle, it would most likely be to a priestly family. Lillian, you're going to?
So the priest had wife?
Yes, ma'am. The priest could have wives.
Oh, I thought they couldn't marry.
Handmade stuff that came later on.
That's something that they taught later.
Yeah, but no, the priest could marry because the Levitical tribe was a tribe. And think about this: who were Nadab and Abihu? Right, but they were Aaron's son. He was his children, so they were able to have children and be married and things like that.
Right.
Maybe that's why she didn't bring the baby until it was weaned. But I was thinking that the priest couldn't marry and then have no wife. I was going to say, how could he raise a child, before he was weaned? That's probably why she took it after he was weaned. He wouldn't have to worry about the bombs and all that.
Well, Johnny is a priest and he's got kids.
Who?
Johnny's the priest and got kids. Yeah.
That's why it's important.
Who just Johnny?
That's what
That's Johnny right there.
No, you don't priest.
That's
Yeah.
why. That's why I tell people all the time to read and study and don't go on what you know. Go on what you be getting from the book. Because sometimes we take it for granted that a thing was a certain way because we see how people are doing things today and things like that. So we need to get what the Bible is telling us instead of what we see going on in
Right.
the world today. So there's another point I want to say about Samuel. The priest always got what was offered to God, and so they took it to their family to eat because they was only one certain thing they had to eat right there. They couldn't take it nowhere. So,
Right.
so the family, all the families of the Levites were taken care of by the people, but the high priest and his family they got things from what was offered to God. In a sense, and it's not how all the priests, the Levitical tribe, that the children of Israel took care of them.
Right, because God didn't give them their own portion of land.
Right.
They had to live in and among certain cities or on the outskirts of cities of the other tribes. Right. So let's take a look at this song that Hannah sings, and then we'll probably have to start back there again next week.
Explain to her that they're priests today and we marry and we got kids.
Oh, whenever.
Don't let that go.
Sorry, whenever Keith mentioned that Johnny was a priest, he meant like in the New Testament sense, like a royal priesthood. He wasn't talking about like a Catholic priest.
No.
I think she knew. I think she knew that. She was just being
She
silly.
didn't know that.
Yeah, I've heard it said that we are all priests.
Right. So
You heard it said.
That's what the Bible teaches.
well, that's what Jesus said. You heard it been said. Okay. Or I like what the Hebrews writer says. It is somewhere stated.
Yeah, when he said that, but there was a butt coming in there.
Right. Well. Yeah.
Ain't no butt with that.
Right. Okay, 1 Samuel 2, chapter 2, verse 1. Then Hannah prayed and said, "My heart exults in the Lord. My horn is exalted in the Lord. My mouth speaks boldly against my enemies because I rejoice in your salvation." That's a little bit different than before, right? Than just speaking in her heart. Now she speaks boldly. Do you think her enemy is the other wife? Or do you think she's talking just in general? She says in verse 2, "Indeed, there is no one besides you, nor is there any rock like our God. Boast no more so very proudly. Do not let arrogance come out of your mouth, for the Lord is a God of knowledge, and with him actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty are shattered, but the feeble gird on strength. Those who were full hire themselves out for bread, but those who are hungry cease to hunger. Even the barren gives birth to 7, but she who has many children languishes. Wait, 7's not many? Okay, the Lord kills and makes alive. He brings down to Sheol and raises up. The Lord makes poor and rich. He brings low, he exalts, he raises the poor from the dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with nobles and inherit a seat of honor. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and he set the world on them. He keeps the feet of his godly ones, but the wicked ones are silenced in darkness. For not by might shall a man prevail. Those who contend with the Lord will be shattered. Against them he will thunder in the heavens. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth, and he will give strength to his king, and will exalt the horn of his anointed. So this is the song that Hannah sings, and you can probably see some similarities between this and what is spoken of by Mary in the book of Luke. Just the things about the holiness of God and the perfectness of God and the exalting of God's anointed and things like that that are being discussed here in 1 Samuel chapter 2. Lonnie?
Yeah, I would say this point about my horn is exalted. And so horn there is a what do you call it? Symbolism of like strength or something like that.
Right.
Mighty. So that word sometimes we need to pay attention to too.
Right, it is this word that's translated horn is also translated, or is also used to talk about something that kind of looks like an elephant's tooth, or the corner of an altar, or the peak of a mountain, or a ray of light. And like you said, it's a symbol of power. And so what we'll do next week is we will start here back in verse 1, and we'll look through at these different statements that Hannah makes and discuss those. So whenever we have time. Does anybody have any closing comments or questions or anything like that? Miss Donna.
This song that she sings is showing her faithfulness to the covenant that she had made with God.
That's right. She promised that God would give her a son, or she hoped that God would give her a son, and that if he did, she would dedicate him to the Lord, and she followed through with that. How many times have you heard someone pray, "Oh Lord, if you just let me live through the day, I'll serve you every day of my life"? And then what happens? Do they? Sometimes we make promises to God without ever even following through on them at all. And that was very important for Hannah. She was very dedicated to God, and she really wanted this son. And then she followed through with the commitment that she made. We need to learn to do that as well. If we make a commitment to God, if we promise him that we'll do something in return for a prayer request that we make, we should do that. Lonnie?
During this time, and later too, but it was important to a woman to bear children.
Right.
And if a woman couldn't bear children, they looked down on her, and as not being a woman because she wasn't able to bear. And that was hurtful for her, and how she would look down.
Right, exactly. The whole inheritance system revolved around whether or not she bore any children. Okay, that brings us to a